I don't know if all of you watching are 90s kids or 80s kids, but if you were born and raised in the 80s and 90s, you remember an actor named Rick Moranis. Rick Moranis was and is a very gifted comedian. So funny. He was, I don't know if he was a knee slapper, but if he was that kind of comedian. But he was a nerd. That was his thing, was that he always looked the part of a nerd. He acted like a nerd. He acted awkward. He was always the smart but awkward guy. So I guess in some ways I feel like many of us identified with him. Not necessarily because we thought we were smart, but there's always a number of us in school and afterward that were kind of pegged as dorks and weren't always popular with the ladies. So so you kind of get the feeling that Rick Moranis was always that kind of character. I don't know if he's like that in real life in any way, but he always did a good job portraying the dork. And in the movie in the movie we're talking about today, Honey, We Shrunk the Kids. Again, he plays a smart but kind of dim-witted dork. He invents a machine that can shrink objects down to microscopic levels. And as the title suggests, there is an accident that causes the machine to go off and shrink his kids. So the movie focuses on, for the most part, the kids. Even though Rick Moranis is a supporting role in this movie and he is very funny, it's mostly a story of the kids trying to survive in their front yard. Which, if you put it that way, it doesn't sound that exciting. But if you're microscopic, if you're the size of of someone's thumbnail, there's lots of things that were minor inconveniences before that can become life-threatening, like spiders, ants, other creatures like scorpions, cats, dogs, and it kind of has that. It kind of borrows that concept. It seems to me it borrows that concept from the Incredible Shrinking Man, which was made in the 50s, about a scientist that he is stricken with some kind of medical condition when he's traveling out outer space, and this condition causes him to shrink and shrink continually. He never stops shrinking. And before he knows it, he's so small his wife can't find him, and he's running through his basement trying to avoid getting killed by a spider and by drowning and things like that. I mean, a little puddle of water can kill him. So suddenly the whole basement becomes an adventure story, or an adventure setting. And the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids is very similar. Because this was made in the 80s, it has a better look. It has what I suspect is a bigger budget than The Incredible Shrinking Man. It has very impressive set designs. I'll say that about the movie. Like, when I think of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, I think of incredible hand-built sets of things that are miniature, or in real life they're miniature, like a little cookie, but built to look like it's the size of a car. That's actually really cool. It makes this movie feel very otherworldly, and it takes something as simple as a blade of grass and turns it into a slip and slide for the kids to slide down on into the water or into the mud in their yard. The movie also uses old special effects tricks like stop motion. There's a giant ant in this movie and a scorpion, both of which are brought to life using, for the most part, stop motion for the wide angle shots, but for the close-ups the creatures are animatronic puppets. And so it's a very charming look for this movie. As for the actors, they're all pretty good. Honestly, you probably could have traded out any of these child actors with a child actor from any other Disney movie, and it probably wouldn't have made that big a difference. I definitely didn't feel super attached to any of the kids. Again, the kids did a good job. They did good. But again, because it's more of a light-hearted movie, it's a movie that doesn't really depend on spectacular performances to be good. The performances were passable. Or they were not passable, but they were above average. The one standout is the father, who is trying to help find his kids and then and grow them back to their real size, played by Rick Moranis. He's pretty funny in this movie. Because he has more limited screen time than the kids do, he doesn't get as much to do in this movie, but he's still a pretty funny presence, and you definitely feel for him. He always does a good job playing a character that, dim-witted as he may be and lack common sense, he's still very likable. So that part, he does a good job in this movie. And I'm glad they kept bringing him back for the sequels, because if you've seen the sequels, the other kid actors and the wife don't come back, but they don't bring back the same actors for the most part. The only reoccurring actor is Rick Moranis. But he's a big draw, and he's a good presence in this movie, so that's always good. Overall, it's a movie that really, even though I definitely would put it in the category of science fiction, I think a more appropriate label would be a Disney movie with a science fiction context, which isn't bad. It's more of like a science fiction movie for kids. If you're worried that your kids may not be old enough to see certain sci-fi movies that may have some violence in them, this one is pretty good. This one's a pretty good start. Weirdly enough, I actually saw the sequel, Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves, before I saw this movie. Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves and I didn't know this at the time when I first saw it as a kid, has a ton of pretty shameless product placements. And basically the whole movie feels like a big toy commercial for little race cars. Which, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. There's a scene where the parents get inside their son's Hot Wheel race car, and they slide down this track that he has layered all over his room. And they spend a good 2 or 3 minutes just flying through this track. But the way it's shot feels like an extended toy commercial for race cars. So, I guess it worked, because as a kid, all I wanted was to buy race cars after watching that movie. So it worked on me anyway. But thankfully, this movie, the original, doesn't have that kind of product placement. At least none that I noticed. So, it's good. Not as memorable as it could have been, but it's pretty solid. The effect and look of these tiny objects being made huge, like blades of grass, food, ants, bugs, all that is done really well. And that's probably the movie's best selling point, is it feels like a jungle adventure, even though it's in your front yard. So, it's pretty fun, and I definitely recommend it for you and your kids.